Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to try to answer a question that's been on a lot of people's minds lately. Could Gavin Newsom be our next president?
It's definitely a question worth exploring. He's the governor of California, of course, but there's been a lot of buzz about his national ambitions.
Yeah, and, he's certainly not afraid to make bold moves.
That's for sure. I mean, you just have to think back to 2004 when he was mayor of San Francisco. He made headlines by issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples, even though it was against state law at the time.
Right, it was a huge controversy, but it also put him on the map as a national figure.
Absolutely. It was a really defining moment in his career, showed he was willing to take a stand, even if it meant going against the grain.
It's interesting, though, because his path to politics wasn't exactly traditional.
No, you're right about that. He actually started out as a businessman.
Yeah, he founded the Plumpjack Group, which had some pretty big names backing it.
Oh, yeah, some serious investors like Gordon Getty, the billionaire heir.
But even back then, there were signs of his rebellious streak.
Totally. There's this great story about him fighting with San Francisco bureaucrats over a sink.
A sink?
Yeah, for his wine store. They insisted on this super expensive custom sink, and he saw it as just ridiculous bureaucratic overreach.
Sounds about right for San Francisco.
Well, and that kind of resistance to what he saw as unnecessary rules, it became a theme throughout his political career.
So how did he go from battling over sinks to running the state of California?
Well, it all started in San Francisco politics. He got his foot in the door thanks to former Mayor Willie Brown.
Good old-fashioned connections.
Yeah, Brown appointed Newsom to the city's Parking and Traffic Commission first, and then to the Board of Supervisors just a year later.
So that mentorship from Brown must have been pretty influential.
Oh, for sure. Brown was a master of San Francisco politics, and Newsom learned a lot from him.
But Newsom wasn't just a puppet. He quickly made a name for himself.
Right? He had this interesting mix of views. He called himself a social liberal and a fiscal watchdog.
Kind of straddling that line between progressive values and responsible spending.
Exactly. It was a combination that appealed to a pretty broad range of people in San Francisco.
And then, of course, came that huge win in the mayoral race in 2003.
And then, bam! A year later, he's making national news with the same-sex marriage decision.
It was brilliant, really. It positioned him as a champion for LGBTQ+ rights, and that resonated far beyond San Francisco.
It really did. It was a bold move and a risky one, but it paid off big time for him politically.
He did face some criticism, though, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some people said he was more about style than substance.
And there were concerns about his handling of homelessness in San Francisco, a problem that still persists today.
True, but he was reelected in 2007, so those concerns clearly didn't derail his career.
So after 2 terms as mayor, he decides to go for lieutenant governor, which isn't exactly known as the most exciting job.
No, it's often seen as a bit of a stepping stone. But Newsom used his time in that role to stay active and visible.
He had his own show even, right?
Yeah, the Gavin Newsom show. He talked about all sorts of things. Criminal justice reform, cannabis legalization. He really dug into some complex policy issues.
But he was using that platform to prepare for a bigger role.
Seems like it. And it worked. In 2018, he won the California governorship by a landslide.
Which brings us to the present. He's leading the most populous state in the country, but it's been a pretty bumpy ride at times.
Definitely. He's pushed through some very progressive policies, but he's also faced a ton of criticism.
His climate change policies, for example. He's been super aggressive in trying to reduce emissions.
Absolutely. He's set some really ambitious goals, like banning the sale of new gas-powered vehicles by 2035.
That was a huge move. But some people say it's just not realistic.
There are definitely questions about the feasibility and the potential economic impact.
And then there's COVID-19. His pandemic response was a major turning point in his governorship.
It was. He was one of the first governors to implement strict lockdowns.
Which initially earned him praise, but as the pandemic dragged on, those measures became more and more controversial.
You had businesses pushing back, people questioning the economic fallout. It became a really divisive issue.
And of course, there was that whole French Laundry incident.
Oh yeah, dining at that fancy restaurant while telling Californians to stay home. Definitely didn't look good.
It hurt his image, for sure. Even some of his supporters were critical.
It played into that perception that he can be a bit out of touch.
He's also been criticized for his handling of California's wildfires.
They're a constant threat in California, but there were questions about whether his administration's prevention efforts were actually effective.
And there were accusations that they inflated the numbers regarding how much land they had treated.
It all added fuel to the fire, so to speak.
His energy policy has been controversial, too. He wants to move away from fossil fuels, But he's also had to deal with the reality of the state's energy needs.
Yeah, his stance on fracking has been kind of all over the place.
Not exactly a picture of consistency,
No, not really.
but it's not all bad news. He's been a strong advocate for gun control, abortion rights, and expanding health care.
True. He's made California a sanctuary state for people seeking abortions.
He's also been vocal about trying to solve California's housing crisis,
It's a huge problem, and he's pushed for more development and tried to fight against NIMBYism.
which is that not in my backyard attitude that often blocks new housing projects.
Right. He signed bills to streamline the approval process, but progress has been slow.
And lately he seems to be interested in engaging more on the international stage.
He went to El Salvador to talk about immigration issues.
And he even met with President Xi Jinping in China.
They discussed climate change, trade relations, and the fentanyl crisis.
So he's definitely trying to raise his profile on global issues.
It seems that way.
So overall, he's a complex figure with a mixed record.
That's fair to say. He's ambitious, and he's shown leadership in some areas, but he's also faced his share of setbacks and criticism.
Which leads us back to our original question. Does he have what it takes to be president?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer it, we need to take a closer look at his strengths and weaknesses as a potential candidate.
Let's dive into that after a quick break.
All right, so let's dig into Newsom's strengths. What makes him a contender?
Yeah, what's working in his favor?
Well, one thing that stands out is his communication style.
Yeah, he's a pretty good talker.
He is. He's very articulate, comes across as genuine.
He seems comfortable whether he's giving a speech or handling a tough interview.
Exactly, and that matters a lot in today's world. You need to be able to connect with people through the media.
Cut through all the noise.
Exactly.
Right.
And Newsom's pretty good at that.
He's also not afraid to take a stand even if it makes him unpopular.
That's true.
Yeah.
He's definitely shown a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Like with same-sex marriage, climate change, gun control.
All big issues.
Yeah.
And he didn't shy away from the fight.
Some people might see that as a weakness, though.
How so?
Well, some voters might think he's too confrontational, too eager to jump into controversial battles.
Yeah, that's a fair point. He does have a tendency to pick fights.
But he has shown that he can compromise, too. Right?
He has, for example, there was that whole thing with water sharing agreements in California.
Oh, yeah, trying to balance the needs of farmer cities and environmental groups.
Exactly. It was a tough issue with a lot of stakeholders, but he managed to bring people together and find some common ground.
So maybe that's a sign that he can be pragmatic when he needs to be.
Possibly. And that ability to negotiate and build consensus could be really important if he were president.
What about his ability to raise money? Presidential campaigns are expensive.
Oh yeah, they're incredibly expensive. But Newsom's got a good track record there.
California's got a lot of wealthy donors.
It does, and he's been pretty successful at tapping into that network.
So he's a strong communicator,
Yeah.
not afraid of a fight, and a good fundraiser.
That's a pretty solid foundation for a presidential candidate.
Okay, so those are the pluses.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the minuses? What could hold him back?
Well, one potential obstacle is his close association with California politics.
Yeah, some people see California as being out of touch with the rest of the country.
There's definitely that perception.
Like the whole coastal elite stereotype.
Exactly. And whether it's fair or not, that stereotype could hurt him.
Especially if he's running against someone who can paint him as a San Francisco liberal.
Someone who's out of touch with the values of middle America.
And then there are all the problems that California is facing right now.
Like what?
Homelessness, the high cost of living, businesses leaving the state.
Right. Those are all issues that his opponents could use against him.
They'd say, look, his policies haven't even worked in his own state.
And they'd argue that his progressive approach just doesn't work in the real world.
So he'd have a lot of explaining to do.
He would. He'd need to convince voters outside of California that he understands their concerns.
And that his ideas could actually work for the whole country.
Exactly. He'd need to connect with people on a personal level.
Yeah.
Share his vision. Show that he gets it.
He'd also have to deal with those controversies from his past.
The French Laundry incident, the pandemic, unemployment fraud.
Yeah, those are definitely vulnerabilities.
His opponents will bring those up for sure.
So his campaign would need to have a good plan for dealing with those attacks.
Absolutely. They'd need to be ready to respond quickly and effectively.
And they'd need to control the narrative.
Spin it in a way that benefits Newsom.
Make him look good and his opponents look bad.
Basically.
It sounds like a tough job.
It is. Presidential campaigns are brutal.
But it's not just about policy and defense, is it?
No, definitely not. Newsom would also need to connect with voters on an emotional level.
Show his human side.
Exactly. Let people see his personality, his charisma.
Make them like him. Trust him.
Right. At the end of the day, people vote for the person they like and trust.
Okay, so we've talked about his strengths and weaknesses. and the challenges he'd face.
We have.
But there's one more big factor we need to consider.
What's that?
The political landscape in 2028. Nobody knows what it's going to look like.
That's true. A lot can change in 4 years.
I mean, just look at what happened in 2024.
Trump won the election.
Nobody saw that coming.
It was a huge upset, and it totally changed the game for Democrats.
Now Kamala Harris is leading the party.
It's a whole new ballgame.
So it's impossible to say what the political climate will be like in 2028.
Yeah, we're in uncharted territory here.
But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
If Newsom decides to run for president, he's going to be under a microscope.
Oh, yeah. Every aspect of his life will be scrutinized.
His family, his finances, his past.
Everything. He'll need a thick skin and a strong support system.
So to sum it up,
Newsom's got some real strengths as a potential candidate.
he's a good communicator,
Yeah.
a fighter, a fundraiser.
But he's also got some weaknesses.
His close ties to California, controversies in his past.
And the political landscape in 2028 is a total unknown.
So it's really too early to say whether he has a shot at the White House.
It is. But it'll be interesting to see how things play out over the next few years.
All right, well, let's take a break and then we'll come back and talk about some potential strategies Newsom might use if he decides to run.
All right, so let's say Newsom does decide to run for president. How does he win?
What kind of campaign does he need to run?
Well, he can't just focus on California issues. He needs a message that resonates with voters across the country.
Yeah, like what kind of issues?
The economy, healthcare, education,
Yeah.
stuff that everyone cares about.
Okay, so the economy. What's his plan?
He'd need to talk about jobs, wages, inflation, pocketbook issues.
Made people feel like he understands their struggles.
Exactly. And he could highlight his experience as a businessman.
Show that he knows how to create jobs and grow the economy.
Right. But he'd also need to address the perception that California is hostile to business.
Yeah, all those high taxes and regulations.
He could point to examples of businesses that have thrived in California.
Show that it's not all doom and gloom.
And he could talk about the benefits of California's environmental policies,
Frame it as a positive.
like attracting innovative companies that care about sustainability.
Okay, that's the economy.
What about
What about healthcare?
That's a tough one. It's such a complex issue.
And it's been so politicized.
Newsom has a good record on expanding healthcare access in California.
But how would that translate to a national level?
That's the question. Would he support a single-payer system?
Or would he try to build on the Affordable Care Act?
And how would he address the issue of rising healthcare costs?
Those are all questions he'd need to answer.
He'd need a clear and convincing plan.
Okay, and what about
Uh,
education?
He could talk about his work in California.
Expanding pre-K, increasing funding for schools,
And he could propose similar policies at the national level.
make college more affordable, address teacher shortages.
And he could emphasize the importance of preparing students for the jobs of the future.
Focus on STEM education, vocational training.
Show that he's thinking about the long term.
So a lot of ground to cover on the policy front.
Yeah, a lot of details to work out.
But he's also got to deal with those past controversies.
The French Laundry, the unemployment fraud.
Those are going to come up.
Oh, yeah. His opponents will definitely use them against him.
So how does he handle that?
He needs a good campaign team, one that's prepared to fight back.
They need to anticipate the attacks and have a plan for responding.
And they need to be quick.
Get ahead of the story.
Control the narrative.
Make sure Newsom's side is the one that gets heard.
Exactly.
But it can't just be about playing defense. He needs to connect with voters on a personal level.
That's right. He needs to show his human side.
Let people see his personality, his charisma,
Make them like him. Trust him.
because ultimately that's what it comes down to.
People vote for the person they like and trust.
So Newsom has his work cut out for him.
He does. If he wants to be president, he's going to have to run a really smart campaign.
He'll need to address the tough issues, connect with voters on a personal level, and overcome the baggage from his past.
It's a tall order, but it's not impossible.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today.
I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Gavin Newsom's presidential prospects.
We covered a lot of ground, his background, his strengths and weaknesses, the challenges he'd face if he decides to run.
And some potential strategies he could use to win.
It's a fascinating story, and it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds.
As always, we want to hear your thoughts.
Could Gavin Newsom be our next president? Let us know in the comments.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. We'll see you next time.